He was officially deleted, removed, and archived. But now, he's back. So it all begins near the very start of the world, back when the overworld spirit, or God, had just started creating life on this world that we would all come to know so well. And things were going really well for this godly entity, as there were oceans and trees and animals. Everything was perfect. And so he believed that he was ready to create the very first form of sentient life. And thus, he created an entity in his image, a humanoid being who would rise up and control these lands. Everything was perfect about this being, down to the very finest details. He had a big smile and a bright blue shirt, as well as strong arms and a mind of infinite capabilities. He had created the original Steve. However, upon placing him into the world, something just felt wrong. He didn't feel ready for this. The Steve just wasn't right for the world yet. And so he deleted Steve from the world, removed his existence from the memory of all other beings, and he archived the code. He planned that when he was ready, he would release it once again, and the sentient life would then go forth and would make this land greater than he ever could. But that would be in the future. So, billions of years went by, with nothing really being done with that Steve. The overworld spirit had made the decision to just forget about the Steve for now, and instead make completely different forms of sentient life that he would focus on, those being the villagers and the illagers. Now, after an even longer period of time, he eventually decided to finally add the Steve to the game, or more accurately, allow for the natural processes within the world to occur for Steve to be manufactured by the illagers. But when he was doing this, he decided not to use that original archived code of Steve, but instead to make something brand new. Now, we based this new creation off the original, but this new Steve was just better in every possible regard. He was taller, and stronger, and more refined. As well as that, this new Steve had far more complex code that was lacking in the original, and that complex code would allow the Steve to interact with this world in many more ways. As after all, this Steve was about to be placed into a world that was far more advanced than the primitive lands that the original was made to deal with. In fact, this new Steve would be so complex that he would be able to achieve almost anything with just a bit of work within that world. This new Steve was truly perfected. He thought the original was good, but no. This new Steve, well, he was great. So, more time passed, life kept on living, the overworld kept on spinning, and the Steve would grow in numbers, and many great stories would unfold within the lands. The overworld was a truly fascinating place, until 9 years ago, when it happened. He woke up. Somehow the original Steve was back, but he wasn't in the overworld. Well, not yet anyways, as he was in the land of the Forgotten Code. This was a dimension parallel to the overworld. It was where anything forgotten or removed was placed. And so the original Steve was surrounded by all other removed features. There were dirt slabs, and crying obsidian, and rubies, and the subscribe button, and many others too. All were very interesting items that had so much potential, but none of them existed in the game anymore. So they were all just floating there, in the void of forgottenness. Occasionally a glimmer of light would shine through this land, in the form of dying code. But other than that, this place was a cold, dark, lonely wasteland. None of these items would ever return to the game, and so they were destined to remain here for the rest of eternity. Well, maybe not that Steve, as he was back, and he was fighting to survive. It was a struggle just to be conscious. He was resisting as hard as he could against the oppressive isolation, and the sheer cold of the Forgotten Code dimension. And he was winning. Sort of. He hadn't died yet, so that was a success. And thankfully, in a rather short period of time, he redeveloped the ability to move, and so he began to run through the void of nothingness. He leapt onto dirt slabs, and the code of those dirt slabs were linked to dirt blocks for some reason, and so he was given a ton of dirt blocks. But that was useless to him. The cold of the void was pressing against him, so he was going to die. That dirt certainly wasn't going to help with that, but still, he was resilient and he refused to give up, and so he used those dirt blocks to pillar up to a crying obsidian block. he hoped that there would be warmth there, as obsidian was made from literal lava. This should save him, right? And so he touched the block, praying for warmth. He was teleported to a ruined portal within the overworld. There was crying obsidian there too. It was different though. It had a different texture, and it expelled this purple glowing aura. The code from the old crying obsidian must be linked to this new crying obsidian, and that's probably how he got here. That would make some logical sense. But that wasn't too important to think about, because at last, Steve was back. He was in the overworld, but he was suffering. The void and the realm of the Forgotten Lands had done quite some damage to him, both physically and mentally, as his ribcage was showing, and the robotic side of his code began to shine through, as his skin revealed its true metallic form. Also, his body was covered in blood, but all that coolness from the void had frozen his appearance in place, and he was stable now. So, physically, he was okay, and thus, while he might have looked like he was dying, he was actually going to be just fine. The aesthetics weren't too important, but also, he had gone a little bit insane. He had been trapped in the void for way too long, and so his mind was a little broken, to say the least. So, he definitely wasn't a Steve anymore. No, instead, he was archived. And so Archived, confused, but also intrigued, began to wander around this world. It had been billions of years after all, and so there were many things he had left to explore, as the world was just so primitive when he was lost in it. But now it was a complex tapestry of life and wonder, and so began his travels. He found fish, and forests, and temples, and deserts, and so much more. And eventually, he decided to interact with this world, and so very cautiously, he touched a tree and attempted to mine it. It should be the same as when he was in this world all that time ago, right? But as soon as he did that, the tree began to shake, and it started to corrupt. Its texture was going away, and then there was a blinding flash of light, and it looked like it had just exploded. What? That was odd. He didn't remember that being a thing when he was around, but maybe just that type of tree did that, as he saw no reason for all trees having that odd self-defense ability, and so he wandered over to a different tree, and he attempted to mine that instead, but it also corrupted and exploded. Interesting. It must just be a feature of all trees now, maybe? No, that was strange. Why would that be a feature? But he was no omniscient god. He couldn't say why things were the way they were, and so he continued to walk on, exploring this magnificent world, and also staying far away from those trees, until he came across a massive mansion. That was an incredible structure. He had never even thought that something as big as this would be possible to build within this world. But there it was, the Woodland Mansion. It was awe-inspiring to him. So intrigued, he went in and began to explore. The halls of this mansion were fascinating. It just gave off an aura of luxury and perfection. This creation was amazing, but it wasn't his home, and the true owners of this mansion, well, they weren't too happy to meet this intruder, and so they attacked. Axes in hand, they charged. But as soon as they made contact with him, they fell to the ground, dead and in pieces. That was again very odd. Why did the mobs just turn into shards? But maybe that was just a thing they like to do. He hadn't been in the world for so long, and so he just assumed that things really had changed a lot. And thus he just continued with his adventure into the mansion, and he eventually made his way to a small dim room. In that room, there was a tree, and an evoker was mining it. But the tree wasn't corrupting, or exploding, or shaking. It was actually being mined, just as he remembered. But the evoker saw him, and so it charged. But just like the others, as soon as it made contact, it also collapsed into shards. So, just seeing the evoker mine that tree safely, Archive decided to try and mine that tree, thinking that he must have just been trying to mine the wrong type of trees earlier. However, when he tried to do that, this tree began to shake and corrupt, and then it exploded. This was very odd. Why did it do that for him, but not for that evoker? Wait, he was probably the one in the wrong here, as perhaps he was just mining the tree incorrectly? He didn't know, and so he decided to run out of that mansion and begin his search for other intelligent life, preferably ones that were a bit more talkative and didn't want to just break down into shards, as he was truly curious to figure out what was going on. Why was everything so weird when he tried to interact with things? And he was also very curious as to why you haven't subscribed yet. But anyways, he wasn't able to find any other beings like him during the next few days of his travels. But he did find a village, and so he entered it with enthusiasm. Maybe these villagers would be able to educate him on what was going on. But, well, let's just say things didn't go too well, as everything he touched within that village corrupted, and the village was set ablaze, and all the villagers were killed. He really didn't intend for that to happen, but it did just happen. He caused all that. Now thankfully, he was able to escape from that, unlike any of those villagers, and so despite all the dangers that he had been put in so far, he was safe. But ultimately, he was more confused than anything else. He just didn't understand why the world hated him. But still, he carried on travelling through this new world, hoping to find answers. And he was about to. As one night, when he was just wandering by a river, he saw a lily pad in the distance. That's cool. He hadn't seen a plant like that before, and so he ran over to investigate it. But as soon as he was close enough to touch it, a being rose from nothingness on that lily pad. It was a red-eyed demon, and it was in a white cloak.
Your code is very different from all others. You were made for a world that effectively no longer exists. You are wired in such a way that you corrupt everything you touch. As this world, and in fact, no world, was made for a being like you. And yet, here you are, stable enough to be walking around, and still living. In fact, you are the only being throughout all worlds that currently exist who is like this. You are completely unique. And your powers have great potential, and so I want you. You shall be a weapon for me.
The cloak demon lunged right at Archived and stood right before him. Archive felt a weird feeling well up inside him. Something wasn't right. The demon's eyes were glowing brighter and more red. He couldn't move. He was forced to just stand there and watch. Suddenly, the demon began to screech, and then everything went white. He felt disoriented, and as the whiteness began to fade, he realized that he was falling, but this was no regular fall. No, he was falling through the very fabric of space and time, as he was time traveling across the universe. He was in a new world, but this wasn't the overworld. But it was close. Everything looked similar, just very green. And he was in another village, when suddenly he heard a loud chicken cry out for help. Archive wanted to run away. He knew that he would only do more harm than good. But he also felt drawn to that chicken. He had to do something to help it. It didn't deserve to suffer. And so he wandered over to the chicken, ready to help him, when a book came into his possession from nothing. Somehow, the chicken saw that book in his hand, and instinctively, it bit it. Archive threw the book down in a panic. How did that book come into his hands? He was confused and disoriented, and so he ran away from that mysterious book that had just been given to him, and away from that village, and away from that chicken. His mind was spinning so much with confusion that he ended up falling into a cave. But as he fell, he froze in place. Time slowed down, but only for him. The world around was going fast. Days went by in a mere few seconds, and then the demon emerged from the shadows and spoke.
You have been excellent. My plan is finally coming into fruition. thanks to you. But now, you need to be sacrificed. I'm sorry, but it's necessary. I will succeed.
Archived was scared, but before he could properly think about it, he was shot up into the sky, and the world began to corrupt. Everything was feeling the effects of Archived, and as such, this world was going to die. It couldn't handle the Archive. As for that demon, well, it escaped that world, and it continued with its diabolical plan, which just so happened to be taking place in another world. But to learn what happens next, you'll need to watch this video.